So this chapter does I think a pretty good job of introducing all of us to what it means to organize, to develop an organization so that it can be a responsible organization. So I'm going to be touching on a few key points, and hopefully that helps to illuminate some of the chapter's concepts. So the overall, what we're trying to accomplish, of course, with the organizing function is a responsible infrastructure. And they're referring to infrastructure here in terms of the internal organization. We're not talking about roads and bridges and that sort of thing. And there are really three phases. So the first is trying to understand the organization, how it's been organized, why it's been organized the way it has, etc. Then the second phase is how we might design the structure to be more responsible. And then finally the third phase is really doing that transformation, so the implementation. So the first part, which is trying to understand the organization, I think that the text is pretty straightforward in this section. And so you'll read, for example, about some opposing views on organizations. This is in section 8.3. The compare and contrast individualism versus collectivism, realism versus constructivism, and then instrumentalism versus institutionalism. And again, I think those are pretty straightforward. Basically, what the authors are trying to accomplish in this first section is helping us to understand, again, how is it that organizations end up being designed the way they are. Now, I need to tie this back to the last function that was discussed, which was the planning function. Really, again, organizing, like planning, is something that the top level management is primarily responsible for. They are the ones charged with, first of all, figuring out what is the long-term vision and mission for the organization, and then as a consequence of that vision, mission, and the strategic objectives or goals, how is it that we want to accomplish what we've said we want to accomplish. So planning is all about the what, and organizing is all about the how. So how will we put ourselves in teams, for example, in order to do what we say we want to do? If you look at table 8.1, there's a pretty nice, I think, and relatively straightforward comparison of different management theories, and then what are some of the consequences associated with those different theories, at least as those consequences might relate to responsible organizational structures. And so the table takes you through a traditional model, what's called the human relations model, and then what might be called the human resources model. And I think it's, again, relatively straightforward for you to compare and contrast the three different archetypes. The table talks about assumptions associated with each, policies that tend to be enacted in each of those archetypes, and then some of the implications associated with each of those. And you'll see there are positives and there are negatives associated with each. There is no such thing as the one ideal organization design. It doesn't exist. And the reason it doesn't exist is a very simple one. There is no one external environment for an organization, and the organizing function is in large measure the organization's way of responding to external opportunities and threats. We organize ourselves in order to meet those opportunities and threats. And so because each organization faces a different set of factors in its external environment, it should be no surprise that organizations, while they may have many elements in common, each has their own unique organizational structure. Now, the second part of this chapter, the second major component of this chapter, really gets into, well, how do we go ahead and structure? So we've spent some time understanding how organizations are organized. Now, let's talk about how we would design the structure. And so there's some terminology with which you need to familiarize yourself. What exactly is organizational structure? Organizational structure, the easiest way that I can tell you to think about it is its differentiation. So taking that overall mission and saying, okay, well, what are all the parts and pieces that need to happen in order to execute that mission? And then integration. How do we coordinate all the different parts? That's where you get things like the chain of command, liaison functions, and so on. So it's differentiation. How do we break ourselves into departments and so on in order to accomplish our overall goal, followed by integration. That's really what structure is all about. It's those two things together. The architecture is all about alignment, okay? And then finally you've got the different structural elements. Those are the pieces. And we really, the text does a good job of diving into the particulars associated with these specific topics. So when we're thinking about creating a responsible business architecture, there are a lot of questions that we need to answer. We need to think in terms of, are we creating a specific area that exclusively coordinates responsible business issues? Do we want to integrate responsible business into existing job descriptions, into the mainstream structure, into our planning documents? How do we go about aligning our existing structure with whatever new aspects to structure that we might want to implement? How do we basically make everything fit? And a key piece here is, how do we make our structure fit with our culture? How do we ensure that both the formal, what we've written down and what we've said we want to do and how we want to do it, how do we make that jive with how things are really getting done, those unwritten norms that people are conforming to? So we want to make sure that we fit those two things together. Then there are issues of naming or labeling, and this is much more important than I think some people appreciate. We really need to say, what is it that we're trying to accomplish? When we say responsible business, are we talking about sustainability all by itself? Are we talking about corporate social responsibility all by itself? Are we talking about ethical behavior all by itself? Or are we in fact really thinking about all three of those in a holistic fashion? Another key question that needs to be addressed as we think about our organizational architecture is, what are we going to displace, if anything? Are we going to be keeping everything that we have currently, or are we going to be displacing some of our existing processes, jobs, maybe even departments? Bottom line, what do we keep versus what do we abandon? What continues to be important as we move towards this new model of organization, and what no longer has relevance? Another key piece is communication. Really thoughtfully, reflectively thinking, okay, how are we going to communicate with everyone in our organization? Ultimately, they are the lifeblood of the organization. How are we going to ensure that our communication is transparent, that we're sharing the information with people that we really need to share, not only sending information to them, but also creating mechanisms for them to communicate with the managers? We need to make sure that information does not face artificial barriers. How do we empower people throughout the organization to really shape the organization in line with this responsible vision? That ties into the empowerment piece. Now, what is it that people really need in order to align their practices and their behaviors with responsible business practice? What kind of decision-making autonomy or latitude do they need? What kind of data do they need? In what form do they need that data? All of these things are decisions that we need to make. Now, there are a number of different organizational design patterns that a given organization might choose from, and we need to ask the big questions. The 30,000 feet questions are, for us, what's the right organizational design for us, for our specific organization, given our strategic vision, mission, our goals, our objectives, the environment that we face, the industry in which we find ourselves? What makes the most sense? So there's sort of this writ large, what's the right design? And then more specifically, what's the right organizational design given that we want to be a responsible organization? And truly, there are advantages and disadvantages associated with all of the different organizational design types. There is no ideal type. Instead, the way it works is there are types that are more or less appropriate given different contingency factors. For example, when you have a very uncertain environment, a more organic organizational design is going to be inappropriate. And that's one where there's a lot of decision-making latitude distributed throughout the organization. There's relatively little in the way of written rules and procedures. At least, again, it's all relative. You are making it so rather than people being narrowly specialized in functions, they're actually not jack of all trade necessarily, but they cross functions in what they do. That's really appropriate when you have a highly unstable and uncertain external environment. If the organization is facing a more stable and certain external environment, well then it's more appropriate to have something closer to a bureaucracy, in the sense that there are lots of written rules and procedures that are put into play in order to ensure fairness and consistency. And for some organizations, that's absolutely going to be the right organizational design. So again, what's key is trying to figure out what are the components to our organization that would dictate whether a given design is going to be more or less appropriate. And you're going to want to look at figure 8.2 in your text to help you understand some of these patterns a little bit better. Now, there are different elements obviously with which you need to become familiar. I think many of these, most of you already are familiar, but it's always good to make sure that we're all on the same page. So when we're talking about top management, we're talking about those people in the C-suite. This is everybody who's got a C in front of their title. So CEO, which is Chief Executive Officer, CFO, which is Chief Financial Officer, COO, which is Chief Operating Officer, and it goes on from there. You could have CTO, CIO. I mean, they're all different variations on this theme. You'll also see in some organizations, they're still considered part of the C-suite. They, instead of having C in front of everybody's name, it's not chief, it's senior. So, for example, senior vice president or executive vice president. Basically, it's the layer of people who report to your top leader. Those are the members of the C-suite. Your board of directors, these are the folks who, depending on the kind of organization that we're talking about, they may serve in the capacity of a control mechanism. They're also providing advice to the organization. They always, for publicly traded organizations, they minimally represent the shareholders of the organization. They typically have both internal and external directors. Internal directors are people who also have a management function within the organization. External directors are people who they're not on the payroll, so they don't have another function within the organization. It's critically important that you understand not all organizations have a board of directors. In fact, the majority of organizations do not have a board of directors, nor are they required to have a board of directors. Now, that said, most people would agree that it is useful, even for very small organizations, to have an external group of advisors, people that can help to guide the organization, whose vested interest is not the same as what a manager's might be. Staff functions, these are defined as those support functions that provide some kind of central service important for the work of the line functions of the organization. Very typically, staff functions will include IT, HR, maybe legal, maybe government relations. So they're not involved in producing the actual product or service that the organization is selling, basically. Line function, these are the main value-creating activities. So in a manufacturing facility, it's going to be anybody associated with production, anybody associated with supply chain. But really, whether a function is line versus staff depends on what the organization overall is doing. So Table 8.2 does a nice job of summarizing some of the structural elements that need to be considered when you're thinking about implementing a responsible infrastructure. My advice to you is look at this table very carefully and then read through the descriptions of each of these. I think you'll find that valuable. All right, last is, how do we actually make this happen? How do we implement this responsible organizational design? And so you'll see the last third of the chapter is really focused around topics like organizational development, talking about culture, and then talking about the leaders who make those things happen. The most important of all of these is culture. Culture is key. It is essentially the glue that keeps the organization together. It's the whole informal system of beliefs and values that drive people's behavior. It consists of the stories we tell, the language we use, the architecture we observe, the physical layout, the ceremonies. I mean, it goes on and on. Those are the visible artifacts that represent those underlying values and assumptions. That, people, you will hear the phrase culture eats strategy for breakfast. Many people will argue that culture is in fact more important than strategic plans if we're trying to understand how organizations really work. So you have in Figure 8.5, some development paths that are outlined that will help you think about, okay, what is it going to take to go from one end to the other, from, not sustainable, not responsible, not ethical, all the way over to restorative in terms of sustainability, civil in terms of responsibility, and ethical. Okay, so it's a good figure to reflect upon. Organizational leadership, of course, is going to, just as is the case with this entire text, we're talking about sustainable, we're talking about responsible, and we're talking about ethics. So, what does it mean? How do we design this organization to ensure that it is sustainable? How do we design this organization so that it's considering the needs of all stakeholders? How do we design this organization so that ethical behavior is encouraged and rewarded? So what is it that the leadership needs to do? There are really three main tasks. One is it's their job to create direction, to convey the vision, the goals, to have thought very carefully about what it is we're trying to accomplish and how we should go about accomplishing it. They're also responsible for creating alignment, making sure that our practices align with what we've said we're trying to accomplish. This is in some respects almost a controlling function. We're trying to ensure that, what we've said is actually what we're doing. And then finally, keeping everyone committed. So what is it that we're trying to accomplish? How do we ensure that everyone is on board? Well, I would argue, number one, you need to treat your employees, it says, as assets, but recognize that they are the difference. They are what make the organization what it is. They are the people who deliver the product, who make and deliver the product. They are the people who make and deliver the service. They are the only thing that a competitor can't directly replicate without actually stealing those people. So they are everything. They, in fact, will build the reputation of the organization. So what does it take to transform an organization's culture? It is no small task. It requires a number of behaviors. These are described in 8.5. It requires careful thinking and attention. Exactly what is it that we want? Let's make sure we praise the good. Let's criticize that which is inappropriate, unethical. Let's communicate to people the values that our organization holds that we consider critical. How we react to crisis is going to say a lot to people. This is where leaders' emotional intelligence is key. They not only have to be aware of and able to manage their own emotions, they have to be aware of and able to help manage others' emotions. This is all part of role modeling, as you might imagine. And then, of course, the reward system comes into play here. We have to clearly, transparently, and in ways that everybody can understand all the time, we have to reward the behaviors that we want people to repeat, and we have to make sure we're not rewarding the behaviors that we don't want repeated. So if we want people to collaborate, we need to create team-based rewards. If we want people to compete, well, then you go for the individual stuff. So much of what we do in organizations, we say one thing and then we do another. We say we want collaboration, we say we want long-term thinking, and then we turn around and we reward people for coming up with their own good ideas and short-term bursts of positivity. We also need to very clearly identify criteria, I should say, for selection and dismissal. Because again, keep in mind what I said earlier, our people are key. So we want to make sure we're hiring the right people and keeping the right people, and when necessary, dismissing people who are not right. 8.5c does a nice job of talking about managing change and some of the issues and why sometimes it's problematic. For example, we don't do enough to create a sense of urgency. We don't get a good enough, strong enough coalition going. We don't have a powerful vision to guide our way. We don't communicate that vision. We don't get rid of the obstacles to that vision. We don't plan for short-term wins. That will always people need to feel a sense of success, and yet we have to be careful to not declare overall victory too soon. And finally, whatever changes we make really need to be anchored in our organization's culture.